Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I wanted to put a few finishing touches on the comments that I began today in class. We were talking about the early experience under the Protestant Reformation, and we left off today talking about John Calvin. I'll just briefly apologize. I'm dressed perhaps a little casually. I just got back from a run this afternoon and kind of looking the part. Anyway. Here we go. So we left off talking. We had spent most of our time this morning talking about Martin Luther and the early reform that he provided and the early leadership that he provided in spurring the Protestant Reformation forward. We also talked briefly about how, although Luther was a remarkable individual for his time, that the people's frustration, the people's exasperation with the Catholic Church in the early 16th century was such that there could have probably been a number of different Luthers who had taken the mantle of opposition against the Catholic Church and still led a sizable portion of Christian followers away from the Catholic Church at that time. And my comments were made in fairly significant depth earlier, so I won't wade back into that. I do want to go back, though, and say one other thing, and this is something that I forgot to mention really in the context of Martin Luther. In the 1500s and the late 1400s in Europe, there was emerging somewhat slowly, but definitely steadily, a little rift in the nature of intellectuals and thinkers in sort of Renaissance era Europe. And what we were witnessing at that time was essentially the dying influence of scholasticism and the emerging significance of humanism. And the differences are this. We know that scholasticism really looked backward, and sort of the founding nature of scholasticism as a mode of intellectual inquiry is simply that all the knowledge that's really truly noteworthy has already been produced. We just need to go back and make ourselves familiar with that. Sort of a static idea about knowledge and the nature of learning. Humanists, in some contrast, believe that humankind was ultimately capable, and that through human curiosity, ingenuity, discovery, that these were essentially very valid traits. They spoke to the potential of humanity. And the humanists essentially were a innovative new, I'll call it pattern of thinking. The humanists essentially were freeing themselves somewhat of the church's constant messaging that humankind is flawed, it is fallen, it is incapable, and strictly reliant upon God's grace for any redeeming purpose that humans might possess. Now, the humanists are going to turn that, I won't say they'll turn it completely on its head, but they're not going to accept that lowly promise of the capability of humankind. And so the humanists start to seek something bigger and better. And I mention this because Martin Luther and John Calvin, two of our the most important Protestant reformers, are both going to find themselves in this latter camp. And it's important to note that it would make sense that humanists would be at ground zero of the Protestant Reformation, because the humanists are sort of throwing away the old institutional power that the church had at that time. And the church was able to do a lot with telling people and reminding people of their lack of potential. But the humanists, again, folks like Calvin and folks like Luther, were saying, no, I think we can do better. And if you start to think about that, at ground zero of the Protestant Reformation, we have this idea that humans are saved not by works, but by grace, by faith alone. and the grace of God that comes from their faith in God. And the idea also that humans are capable of interpreting the meaning of Scripture. Humans are capable of having a more direct relationship with God. This is different from the sort of old, conventional, perhaps even stale prescription of the Catholic Church that, no, you need to rely upon us, you need to accept things the way they have always been. So this humanist scholasticist split is noteworthy. Okay, so now let's enter in John Calvin. John Calvin was, by my recollections, 8 years old when Martin Luther presented his 95 Theses to the world and began in that act the Protestant Reformation. So John Calvin, as a young man, as he is coming of age, is entering very much into a world that is fresh with this idea of the Reformation. John Calvin was a humanist. He studied things like art and law in Paris, and then as a young man enters into the religious thicket, which was one of the most important issues of his time. Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, a century that is chock full of significant worldwide developments. Protestant Reformation is probably the most important event of the 16th century, and here is John Calvin smack dab in the middle of it all. But John Calvin has a slightly different take on things than Martin Luther did. And part of it was Calvin was trying to make sense of some of the changes that are being put forth by Luther. For example, if in fact men are saved by faith and not by faith and works, then what does it mean? How do folks know? How do Christians know if they are in fact saved? There was this notion, this doctrine of free will, that men are free to choose to do good and bad. But Calvin had a fundamental problem with this notion of free will. In fact, he essentially said free will doesn't exist because the nature of God. God is all-knowing. He has sovereignty. He's all-powerful. And therefore, his sovereignty, his all-knowingness, his all-powerfulness means that before anyone even comes into existence, God knows whether that person is saved or not. And so John Calvin puts forth this doctrine of predestination. And in it, he essentially divides people into two camps. There are the elect, those that are chosen by God for grace to be saved. And then there are the damned, those who are not, and presumably those who will go to hell and not experience the grace of God. So what's central to this is, okay, well, if there is predestination and there are the elect and there are the damned, how would one know if they are of the elect or of the damned? Well, John Calvin's answer to that question was not very satisfying to most. His idea was, you don't know. We don't know. But those who are elect will tend to conduct themselves and behave themselves in ways that are pleasing to God. And so while if you act in a way that isn't pleasing to God, one can be almost certain that they are damned. If you act in a way that is pleasing to God, there's a chance that you are among the elect. So John Calvin takes this doctrine of predestination and he essentially introduces it into these little cells or synods, which were little districts of churches that begin in Geneva, Switzerland, but also crop up in areas very close to Geneva in both France and Switzerland. Of course, these terms mean more to us now than they did back then, in terms of Switzerland and France anyway. And anyway, he sets up a very rigorous way of, set of expectations for the people who live in a given synod to conduct themselves. These are things, wake up early, work hard, no dancing, no drinking. Sobriety is emphasized. People will behave in a very morally upright manner. They will not spend their money wastefully. They will save. Essentially, the idea is that you will work hard, you will prosper, and you will then essentially deny yourself the pleasures that come from being a motivated and prosperous worker. And the idea behind this is that these are all ways that one would show in an outward manner that one is elect. Again, you don't know, but your best bet is to demonstrate and behave in a way such as this, and then hope that that will, in fact, turn out for you. So John Calvin has some interesting early exploits where he, essentially runs these cities, like in Geneva, and at first the people are somewhat exasperated and turned off by his strictness and the rigor with which he enforces this behavior and these expectations upon him. He's driven out at times, but then he's also welcomed back. People ultimately determine that his prescriptions and his expectations are what's in their best interest. It's good for their families, for their children. And my last point, what is my last point? The last point being, you can kind of think about John Calvin and these cities, these synods of Calvinist Protestant expression. They're almost like the community-wide equivalent of a monastery. There's elements of the early, Saint Benedict, the prescriptions for how one behaves himself in one of Saint Benedict's monasteries. But this is writ large. This is all families, all communities within Calvin's synod, say in Geneva, all being expected to behave in this way. And as I mentioned in class today, this is going to be of primary influence upon some of the earliest founders of the English colonies in North America. So we bear this stamp, this Protestant work ethic that comes from this absolute emphasis upon moral uprightness and working hard, denying oneself, delaying gratifications, so on and so forth. We have John Calvin in large part to thank for this. And through this early experience, by the end of the 1500s, we have large enclaves of Calvinists in places like Switzerland. There's over 1 million French Calvinists who are known as the Huguenots. There is going to be Calvinism in Scotland, parts of England, parts of the Netherlands, Hungary, all various places throughout Europe are going to bear the stamp of John Calvin's early work. With that, I'll stop. Tomorrow we'll turn our attention to the English Reformation and the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church. Thank you.